Good afternoon. I'm Dan Poneman. I am proud with Admiral Rich Meese to be the co-chair of the Nuclear Energy and National Security Coalition. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon. We had a terrific turnout, and I'm not surprised because we have a terrific guest to enlighten us on the abstruse but all-important issue of nuclear regulatory commission and all of the Sturm und Drang that goes with that. It's a pleasure as well as an honor to introduce former NRC Chairman Dick Meserve. I have known Dick for nearly 50 years. Full disclosure, he offered me my first job in a law firm at Covington and Burling, but it took me 50 years to find out he had clerked for Justice Blackmun. He is from this incredibly talented pool of Stanford graduate students that included Ernie Moniz, Jim Timby, Tom Neff, and other illustrious people. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I would consume the entire time allotted if I went through his many accomplishments, but I would be remiss if I did not know that among them is being awarded from the Emperor of Japan, the Order of the Rising Sun, Gold and Silver Star, for his incredible work, which continues to this day, helping Japan recover from the trauma in every dimension of Fukushima. Dick, welcome.
Thank you, Dan. I really welcome the opportunity to join you. And as you indicated, we have been colleagues for many years, and you've had many important roles in government. We interacted a lot when you were the Deputy Secretary of Energy. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that you were also the recipient of the Order of Rising Sun, Gold and Silver Stars. And I guess we both should be wearing our chrysanthemum medals today. I forgot to put mine on.
I guess my sash is at the dry cleaner. So. Anyway, well, look, there's a whole host of questions, Dick, but I thought maybe before getting into all that, just give you perhaps it's this momentous time in the history of our industry to give us a sort of 60,000-foot overview from your vantage. Where are we going, and how should we be thinking about NRC and nuclear safety and the regulatory environment?
Thank you, Dan. I'm happy to do that. I also want to say I really welcome the interaction with the Nuclear Energy and Nuclear Security Coalition, endorse its recognition of the importance of a healthy and growing nuclear sector in the United States that includes consideration of the national security dimension. Of course, nuclear power responds to the carbon challenge and demands for energy security around the world, but it also has great national security importance as well. A healthy nuclear sector in the United States enables us to maintain a leading role in setting the international standards for safety, security, and non-proliferation, which is really essential for the world's growing interest in application of nuclear technology. It addresses the influence that China and Russia seek to obtain from their nuclear exports. They see nuclear sales as a vehicle for foreign policy influence. If they build a nuclear plant in a country, they have perhaps a 100-year involvement with that country and its nuclear infrastructure, and which they see they can exploit for their own advantage. And beyond that, we need international markets for our vendors if we're going to drive the costs down. Our vendors need to be able to sell internationally. So, and obviously there's also a synergistic connection of the civil nuclear industry with the nuclear navy in the United States, in that it's provides a supply chain and important workforce for civilian nuclear power. And so I think that there were multiple reasons to really emphasize the national security dimension of this, which I don't think gets enough attention. There are many factors that influence the trajectory of nuclear power, and we have to solve a whole bunch of them if we're going to let nuclear power play the role that we think it should play. They involve challenges in the regulatory area, of course, which I'll talk about, but economic, workforce, supply chain, project management, fuel supply, the international marketing I mentioned about security, non-proliferation, all of those are important issues that present matters that need to be confronted. In my view, the chief immediate challenge is economic. We need to drive down costs so that nuclear can compete with alternatives. There's a lot of enthusiasm from nuclear, enthusiasm that's justified in my view, but it appears that no one wants to go first in terms of making a nuclear order. There is this danger of cost overruns and schedule delays that we've observed, not only within the United States, but also in construction in Europe. And there is interest in, I think, in a lot of our utilities and subsequent units, but not to be first movers. And that's because of all the risks that arises from this cost and schedule uncertainty. So there's this great reluctance to go first. And there's a chicken and egg problem here, is that you can't build an order book that justifies a factory, which is the way they hope to reduce costs, unless you have an order book that justifies a factory. You can't build a supply chain without orders. Can't develop a serious workforce without orders and capacity to commit for that, and can't build a management experience without a lot of orders. So there's a lot of things that need to fall into place that require substantial commitment early on to give us the momentum going forward. And that's an economic challenge, and it's going to require continuing federal attention. Nonetheless, the regulatory challenge is important, particularly if the economic challenge is overcome. That's a hurdle that is the next to be confronted. There is legitimate criticism of the NRC for cost, delay, intrusiveness of its regulatory scrutiny. These costs occur at the front end of the process, and they can be very significant. And they pose a particular problem for some of the vendors, which are small companies and are not well capitalized early in their lifetimes. And these concerns need to be taken seriously and need to be redressed. It's obvious that regulatory process can be a barrier and can be an important barrier. Nonetheless, we do need to recognize there is importance to doing the licensing process that is thorough and careful. Some advanced reactors, some of the new technologies present safety challenges that need to be addressed. They're different from those arising from light water reactors. Sodium-cooled reactors confront the challenge of fires from exposure of sodium to air or water. Molten salt reactors can erode piping, and so there are challenges there. You need to assure the adequacy of the passive safety capabilities that the vendors present and evaluate the very different fuel forms that many of them seek to use. So these reactors can present many advantages, but also they present new risks. And those issues need to be confronted by the regulator in a licensing process. There is also, let me say, great value in assuring public confidence that comes from careful regulatory review. It provides reassurance to the public that the claims of the vendors have been subject to very careful and thorough scrutiny, and that can restore confidence and help to overcome the resistance that may exist in some places for new plants. But you need to find a balance. You need careful licensing. You need a process that is efficient, effective, and focused. There has been very substantial progress that is occurring and will continue to occur as a result of the ADVANCE Act. It was passed by the Congress in July of this past year with overwhelming bipartisan support. And it includes a large number of useful elements, and it's going to require a very major effort by the NRC to carefully review its work processes and to focus on what is essential. Some of the elements include reductions of fees for licensing advanced reactors. It provides for DOE prizes to incentivize the first movers. It provides and requires new guidance on licensing and regulation of microreactors. It aims to streamline the licensing process for nuclear reactors at retired coal plants. Those may be very attractive locations because they have, they're committed already, they're brownfield sites to power generation. They may have cooling resources and connections to the grid that already exists, so that there is great opportunities there as we retire coal plants to install low carbon alternatives. The statute also provides authorization for some foreign entities to obtain licenses for reactors in the U.S. That removes a very anachronistic restriction that exists in the Atomic Energy Act when the U.S. had near exclusive control of this technology. Obviously, nuclear technology exists all over the world today and is an unnecessary restriction. It requires the streamlining of NEPA reviews. There are many who have complained that the whole environmental process is one that causes needless delay. And importantly, it enables the NRC to recruit well-qualified individuals that, without regard to civil service restrictions. There's going to be an important need for people who can work at the NRC, who have the knowledge and skills, and we're going to draw them into the agency. So there's a very valuable set of enhancements of the whole process that Congress has demanded. It obviously requires the NRC to undertake many changes to implement them. I am comfortable myself that the NRC has accepted this challenge. The biggest challenge, in my view, that is sort of overarches everything that's in the Advance Act, is to make a cultural change that is driven by the 5 members of the commission and the NRC senior management. There needs to be a strict process that they follow to drive the change and make sure all of these changes that Congress has asked for are implemented in a wise and careful way. Let me say about this, I think there is a very critical role for the project managers on the NRC side. That the way that I think the process they're using now, that when a given vendor comes in, the NRC for processing, and they're encouraged to come in very early, long before they file a license application, that they engage and that there's a team that's established at the NRC to interact with them and to resolve as many issues as possible very early in the whole process of engagement. That requires, in my view, a very skilled project manager who can keep the process of reviews focused and moving efficiently. And I think that is a skill set that that needs to be cultivated at the NRC and deserves a lot of attention. There are many other matters that need change. I would personally eliminate the mandatory hearings that are part of the NRC process. That if you get if you're going to get a construction permit or a combined operating license, there is a requirement for a mandatory hearing, even though there's no one objecting. It's undertaken by the NRC Commission, and I think they have some powers in which they've exercised to make those a written submission. In the case of some of them, to send them off to a hearing officer rather than themselves. But it's a needless delay to have a mandatory hearing, particularly for things that are just follow-ons. I think that there is an opportunity to streamline the whole process of environmental process to enable greater use of environmental assessments. There is a need to finish the rulemaking. They've started on generic environmental impact statements for certain of the applications of advanced reactor. You can do the review of it in the first instance, and then if there's not significant meaningful changes, you don't need to go through the whole process of an environmental impact statement, and save a lot of time that way. So there's a number of things that the NRC could do along those lines that I think that remain ahead, that are challenges that need to be confronted.
That's
So let me stop there.
yeah, that's a big agenda. Yeah, lots of food for thought in there. I'm gonna pluck out a couple of things, and we also have audience questions. So we'll I will try to be succinct in my questions, and we'll try to get through as many as we can so we can get the audience questions in. You talked early in your remarks about the challenge presented by Russia and China that have looked at this in terms of international cooperation as a geostrategic foreign policy tool, which it is, as establishing a 100-year relationship, which it does. And we have not, frankly, excelled at that. Russia's order book's $130 billion. We're still struggling to get, one with Poland going. How should we think about these nascent national nuclear programs? Poland is kind of front and center because they're looking at both SMRs and large-scale reactors. And what can and should the NRC be doing to help these countries so that they can adopt strong safety and security systems and procedures so that they can buy from us without, frankly, perpetuating the challenge of, if we make ourselves so difficult to deal with, we're already hanging on by a thread to international competitiveness. We're getting clobbered, frankly, by Russia, by Korea, by China. Even we're not getting clobbered, we're not in a good place. And as our mutual friend and colleague Ernie Moniz says, no exports, no influence. Right. So how do we square this circle? How can NRC be both effective and lean in helping other countries get up to speed so they can buy American and do so in a way that we don't inadvertently push them into the arms of our competitors?
Well, it's a very important question. And it's my view that a very vigorous program of engagement by the NRC is required to deal with countries that are potentially interested in acquiring U.S. origin reactors. I think that many believe that most of the growth in the applications of nuclear technology will be in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. And we have some interactions in those areas, but very little. And we need to make an emphasis on the countries that are potential recipients of exports from the United States to facilitate their capacity to engage with us productively. And that obviously, I think that we benefit from the fact that the NRC, in terms of a regulator, is really viewed as the gold standard all over the world. That's been certainly my experience from the NRC as chairman, that was the case. And we need to, they want to interact with us. Many of these countries want to interact with us. And that involves, in my view, greater efforts to engage with memorandum of understanding, memorandum of cooperation with these countries to facilitate their appreciation of what it involves to, if you engage with a reactor technology. And that involves obviously legal, social, regulatory, economic components. And I think that that some aspect of those, particularly the legal, regulatory ones, are ones with which the NRC can be very helpful in educating these countries and facilitating their having the capacity to be a wise importer of nuclear technology. But I think it needs to go beyond the NRC. I think that my view, there needs to be basically a country-wide effort to put together a package of interactions that facilitates every dimension of what these countries are interested in acquiring a reactor from us. And that involves the matters I've encouraged, but also has to include some economic involvement and assistance. And that could be in the way of loans, it could be in various other mechanisms, grants of various kinds. Obviously, that some of these activities should be subsidized by the U.S. to facilitate them. But that I think that the Russians and the Chinese view these as and present an integrated package. And the Russians can offer the return of spent fuel, for example, which is attractive. But I think many of these countries would welcome the capacity to interact with the United States on these issues. We're respected. I think that they have observed that the Belt and Road Initiative from the Chinese has saddled them with debts to China that they can't pay. And it has not involved local workforce because it's Chinese workers that go in and do the installation. And, I think American vendors would be wise to realize they should build up in the indigenous capacity to fulfill the responsibilities. But I think we need a government-wide program that is much broader than just the NRC.
I certainly agree with that. And sometimes I say we often in the U.S. we take a knife to a gunfight because our economic tools just don't measure up against the others. We're doing better, but we're not doing well enough. But that's not our remit today on the regulatory side. Just to press one point on that, as you say, NRC is viewed as a gold standard. Are there ways in which we can help accelerate the acquisition of U.S. technology by somehow having the work done by NRC in regulating designs and so forth? I'm not necessarily saying being accepted lock, stock, and barrel, but maybe in terms of the intrinsic design and the safety of the designs, that the NRC Bill of Good Housekeeping could be accepted by an importing nation, and then they would still have to regulate it, but more in terms of any bespoke matters involved with suitability of a particular site from a seismological or other standpoint. Is there some way we could give them a leg up to piggyback, so to speak, on regulatory efforts as opposed to starting with a blank sheet of paper and reinventing the wheel?
I think there is. I think that, the practical reality is I don't think a foreign country is going to buy a reactor from the U.S. that hasn't been built here. They want it just would for them. They're then the first mover. And so I think that there is a interest then in pursuing a reactor that we're exploiting. And that's actually is a seal of approval, basically, that ought to be valuable to a foreign country. That means that design has had very careful scrutiny by the NRC. And we should endeavor in our interactions with the foreign regulator to assist them. They have to take the responsibility for the reactor that's built on their sovereign territory. But I think we can facilitate their understanding of the regulatory process we have followed, what the basis for the decisions has been, and can understand the applicability of that decision to their circumstances. So I think there's a lot more that could be done to make sure that the NRC process is transparent to the foreign regulator and really the foreign operator as well, to understand the technology that has gotten through our process.
Yeah. And let me pick up on one of the elements in your answer, in that a lot of governments would like to see this licensed any design first in the United States. They don't want to, nobody wants to be the first acquirer. But there is, and you and I have discussed this a bit offline, there is this lawsuit, right? A couple of states and a reactor developer that has specifically gone outside the United States to avoid, all this headache. And the theory, I believe, and you're the expert, is that their reactors are so small and the features of them don't actually comply with the requirements in U.S. law that require this level of regulation. Therefore, they should somehow be exempt from that kind of regulation. Could you comment on that new lawsuit that I just read about in the trade press?
Sure, I'd be glad to. This was a very recent filing. It was filed in Texas. It involves Utah, Texas, and a company that's producing a small modular reactor as the plaintiffs. And their claim is that the Atomic Energy Act, as it was promulgated by Congress in 1954, envisioned that the NRC should not license reactors that do not impact public health and safety or the common defense and security. And despite the leniency that was allowed by the statutory language, which was intentional because it reflected a change in the law from an earlier version of what became the Atomic Energy Act. The AEC, when it promulgated its regulations, did not take the opportunity to exempt certain kinds of reactors that were seen to present low risks. In the suit asserts that that many of the research and test reactors and the SMRs present so little risk that they shouldn't be subject to license. Now, this suit was filed on December 30th. The NRC has not had an obligation. NRC is the defendant. Has not had an obligation to file an answer yet. So I can't comment knowledgeably on the legal claims that are made in the suit. I've read the complaint. Let me say that, make just two additional comments about it. This suit is actually helped by two decisions by the Supreme Court in the last term. The first has got a lot of attention. It's the Loper-Bright case that basically changes the Chevron doctrine, which required a court to defer to an agency interpretation of an ambiguous law if the interpretation is reasonable. And the court struck down the Chevron, overruled Chevron, said, no, the court should decide what the law is, not the agency. There's another decision which actually would be important in this. It's a case that's gotten less attention. It's the Corner Post case, which is against the SEC in the Supreme Court. There would have been a statute of limitations argument that you don't have this opportunity, 70 years later to come back and challenge a regulation that was put in place in 1955. Corner Post decided that change the law on the statute of limitations so that an entity that first encounters a regulatory barrier has 6 years within which it can bring the suit. So this entity that's part of it, the SMR manufacturer, could, I presume, can make the claim and get around a statute of limitations restriction that would otherwise exist. So I think that there is some, the Tucker brush has been cleared away by the Supreme Court on unrelated cases. I do think that the plaintiffs need to worry a little bit about what would happen if they should win. If the NRC doesn't regulate, the states still have inherent power to regulate. And so you have the challenge that the states then could regulate these various reactors, and who knows what the regulations could be, but they largely could very well differ from state to state, which would present a commercial challenge. And I think you do need to worry a little bit about being the dog that caught the car, in that there's a lot of public confidence that comes from the fact that the NRC has reviewed something and found it to be safe. And this NRC stamp of approval is important, and you would lose that opportunity. But anyway, we're at the very beginning of the process here, and I presume if the plaintiffs succeed, it will be result in a declaratory judgment that the NRC should undertake a rulemaking to explore the issue of whether there are reactors that present so little risk that they don't need to be subject to licensing scrutiny. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot ahead of us.
Yeah. Interesting. And another issue, which I know when you were recently leading a National Academy of Sciences study, came up in a related study that touches regulation and exports possibly, which is the regulation of high assay, low enriched uranium. Full disclosure, an issue I've worked on a lot in my past lives, and whether this somehow presents a greater proliferation risk, or one that is not adequately addressed by current IAEA safeguards, provisions, and so forth. Could you comment on this controversy and your views on HALEU as a proliferation-related issue?
Sure, I'd be glad to. This controversy really arises out of a paper that was in Science magazine, in which there a group of authors made the claim that HALEU that is close to the 20% enrichment level, which is the upper limit for something to still be HALEU, be low enriched uranium, but high assay. And the claim was made that it could be that at that high enrichment, but less than 20%, could still be used in a nuclear device. And their assertion was that upper limit for HALEU should be adjusted, should perhaps be adjusted downward. And they asserted that some papers, actually unclassified papers from the era of the Manhattan Project, would show that one could assemble a critical mass with less than 20% enrichment. It might be, 14% or an up would be what would be of concern. I'm not in a position to dismiss their claim. Let me say that the constructing a nuclear device with very low enrichment levels would require a huge mass of material, and assembling it, getting it to assemble fast enough to be a nuclear weapon, it might not be very efficient. Certainly wouldn't be very efficient, but it could give you somebody a very bad day. And so I think that there is an issue that needs to be considered. And let me just say, within the last week or so, Jill Ruby, who is the administrator of the NNSA, Department of Energy, which is responsible for weapons-related matters at DOE, has indicated that she is going to ask the National Academy of Sciences to assemble a panel to examine these claims and to issue a report. So, I mean, the DOE is taking these seriously enough that they need to be evaluated. No doubt it's going to be a classified study, but this is a matter in which I think you should stay tuned.
Interesting. I mean, it's a little ironic. I'm old enough to remember the so-called RERTR program, Reduced Enrichment and Research and Test Reactor Program, where the United States has spent like 50 or 60 years getting reactors to leave HEU behind and go to 19.75%. And so I don't know, you'll forgive me some skepticism, and I'm not going to talk about any technical details for 100 reasons, but it seems that bad guys would have a lot easier time doing a lot worse things with a lot less trouble and a lot less money. Like, I won't even go there. So anyway,
I agree, Dan. The fact that it's possible to assemble a weapon with something less than 20% doesn't mean that you should change the limit. You need to take the total circumstances under consideration.
Yeah. And I guess, one other thing I'll say, you're a good lawyer, so I'll admit this a little, it's hearsay in the sense that I heard this from experts, but they are experts who explained to me with great precision why they came to 20% as the limit, definitionally speaking, in the law between HEU and LEU. And I would remind people that the LEU and HALEU stands for LEU, right? So in any event, but I'm probably straying beyond my moderator's role here a little bit. In any event, I want to go back to the very important issue. A couple things I think we really got to touch before the end of the session here. In terms of accelerating the deployment of American technology abroad, you mentioned the Congress passed the Advanced Act 88-2. They passed the Nuclear Fuel Security Act 96-3. So the Congress has been very robust and active. Are there things that Congress can or should do to help promote and accelerate the timeline for getting new and advanced reactors built overseas with U.S. Export controls and non-proliferation conditions on them?
Well, I'm sure there are, I think there are many opportunities to use the existing administrative structure and improve it and build on it to be able to deal with these problems. I'm not sure that congressional involvement is necessary, but it no doubt continuing encouragement of the NRC to deal with these regulatory issues that it demands in the Advance Act is going to be important. And let me say, as I mention, I think that I don't detect any resistance by the 5 commissioners to vigorously enforce what Congress has asked. The problem that they're going to confront is driving that through the agency and building the cultural change that's necessary. And so I do think that there are that is really the biggest challenge. It's not only for domestic applications of nuclear technology, but the international ones we have been discussing.
And I'd like to go to an audience question from a student at Georgetown University. How does nuclear energy's role in powering artificial intelligence capabilities affect national security? It says, what will convince federal policy makers of this connection? I believe they see it already. So I'll just ask you the top line question. How does the role of nuclear energy powering AI, and frankly, the possible role of AI in nuclear energy, how do we think about that from an NRC and a regulatory standpoint?
Well, let me just say that for reasons of the data centers and the AI applications, as you, I know, very well understand, Dan, there's been an absolutely huge growth in the demand for electricity. And so that there is, on the demand side, these sorts of applications require a greater capability on our electricity sector. If that is to be satisfied, I mean, I think that they will demand justifiably very reliable power. And that's likely they're confronted with using nuclear power, which is, of course, very reliable, high capacity factors, or natural gas. And I know what the right answer is from a carbon change perspective. And I very much agree that with the notion that AI, and this is hardly an area in which I am an expert, everything I read is that AI is seen as a sort of a suite of technologies that are going to have huge economic and influence, and no doubt also have great implications for national security beyond the economic security, in that the applications of AI for various national security technologies, I think, is obvious. So I do think that there is a national security impetus to make sure we can meet this increasing demand for both economic and national security reasons using nuclear technology. I am also, though I should say, that I think there is, from what I read, growing interest among the hyperscalers. We're talking here about Google and Amazon and Microsoft and so forth, and fulfilling their low carbon commitments to apply nuclear technology, as we've seen. They've been making some deals for nuclear power plants around the country already, but that's not going to be sufficient to meet the demand. So they're going to need some new plants, and I am hopeful myself that that could be a source of capital for the new construction that we need. These are companies that have the balance sheets that can absorb the risks associated with being a first mover, and certainly have the opportunity to make a large order that could mean they get the benefit of not just the first plant, but whatever number they order, and the cost reductions that result. And that could be an important driving factor that could be a very important opportunity.
Dick, I have to pause to agree with you 100% on that. So if you think about the fact that all of the investor-owned utilities put together have a market cap of about 1 trillion, right? And each of the hyperscalers has a market cap of about 1 trillion. So they now have both the balance sheet and, as you indicated in your response, the demand. So this could be tremendous, transformational. moment. So if, a project is $25 billion, your market cap is $40 billion, that's a pretty tough sell to any board of directors, I can tell you from having lived in that role. So, but we're running a little bit short on time here, but there's one, really tricky issue. It's analytical. And so go back all the way to your Stanford training and so forth. But there's been a lot of criticism over the use of this sort of a linear no threshold test model, LNT, and how it gives rise to the as low as reasonably achievable principle. And the way it's been explained to me in lay terms, it basically posits that radiation doses equate jumping off a 1,000-foot building as being the equivalent of jumping off a 1-foot stoop 1,000 times, which from a common sense perspective doesn't really add up. But I thought perhaps in the few minutes you could enlighten us on if this makes any sense, or if this is in fact a place where we could look for some analytical reform that would lead to regulatory removal of excessive red tape, et cetera.
Well, you're really asking a question. The scientific question you're talking about is whether reliance on the linear non-threshold model is appropriate, and it has its regulatory counterpart, which is as low as reasonably achievable, which is a driving factor by the NRC. From a scientific point of view, it's my understanding that there still remains some controversy as to whether health effects exist all the way down to zero dose, or whether there is some threshold that you don't need to worry about. Certainly, cellular impacts are seen at low doses. The consequences of that are completely unclear. And I guess it's nearly impossible to conduct a scientific experiment on human or animal to clearly delineate the impacts of low dose, because we live in a radiation environment. You don't have a model animal that isn't exposed, because we're all exposed all the time at very low doses. But I think everyone agrees that the risk goes down as the dose is diminished. And I think there should be recognition that there's a practical threshold. That is, the risk at low doses is just so small that it shouldn't be seen to have a regulatory impact. There was some effort to actually make a regulatory change when I was the chairman of the NRC to recognize a below regulatory concern level for radiation. It turned out at that time that was very controversial, and we got beaten over the head and shoulders for proposing it. But the times may have changed. And I do think that this is an area where there may be some, not an area for policy change. I think the scientific controversy is likely to remain, but the practical reality is that there is, nothing to really be observed at low doses, and we ought not to be regulating at that level.
Well, thank you, Dick. We have enough questions to go for another 3 hours, but we're losing our sponsor or something like that. I'll try to use TV term. I want to thank you, and on behalf of everybody in the webinar that's been very heavily attended, to thank you. We are going to put up momentarily a slide with the contact information for the Nuclear Energy and National Security Coalition, and please do feel free to reach out to any and all of us to ask questions or offer thoughts and comments. It's a dynamic process. It's a dynamic moment. I'm extremely grateful personally to Dick, and I'm sure everybody else who benefited from his wisdom today is as well. So thank you, Dick, very much for joining us. Thank all of you out there for posing your questions and listening attentively, and we will look forward to seeing you at the next NENSC occasion. Thank you all, and have a good day.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.